Hello and welcome to the ELNION News Roundup. We're back here for another week. My name is Bill Mew.
And I'm Des Blanchfield.
Des, great to see you again. We've got another round of interesting topics to cover. Obviously, one of the big topics this week has been the EU's introduction of regulation around AI. This leads to a very obvious question. How can we regulate AI effectively?
Indeed, it does. And to that very point, Bill, as you just highlighted, you can't regulate what you can't define and describe. And in one of our latest articles on ELNION, I've posited a couple of key points that I think organizations of all types and shapes and scales should focus on from boardroom down, which is this challenge that the European Union's AI Act has come out with what looked like a fairly clear definition of what the regulatory framework and requirement was. But the challenge is that it doesn't actually define what artificial intelligence itself is. In other words, the thing that it is seeking to police is still yet to be defined. And I think this is where we're going to end up with, excuse me, some very real challenges. And that is that when we look at what people think artificial intelligence or AI is, it's in so many things. It's in cars that help us stay within lanes. If we go across a little white line, it provides a little resistance in the steering wheel. It helps us automatically brake if a car brakes in front of us. It's in robotic process automation. It's in CRMs. It will do things like automatically find signatures. And if there's no signature in the box, or if the signature doesn't match previous ones, it raises alarm. So then you've got this question of, okay, well, AI is permeating every part of life. We've got it in our phones. We talk to Google and Siri if we want to use speech to text. So if we can't clearly stipulate what AI is, then what exactly is it that this regulatory framework is going to police? And I know you've had a lot of time in this space, Bill. What's your thought around this whole thing of how do we define something and then regulate it if we aren't clear about what it is in plain language?
I think it's ever so easy, actually, Des. If you want to know what AI is, you just need to ask Siri or Alexa, obviously. I'm joking, of course, because I think not only do we have a very wide range of different automated systems and structures, but we've been using them all for a great deal of time, and many of them are embedded in all sorts of other different applications. The generative AI generation is fairly new and fresh towards us, and there will be other iterations that are going to follow. But what we're talking about here is a vast spectrum of different technologies that I don't think you can easily define or lump together. The regulation that we're talking about goes on to talk about some very worthy ethical guidelines and recommendations about how you should avoid bias, how that you could operate these systems in an ethical manner. And obviously, another side to this is actually the privacy and security side. And on the privacy and security side, we need to be very aware not only of the personal and private data that we may be consuming and assimilating, but also there's a lot of copyright here, and we'll come on to talk about that in a sec. But then you need the security side, and on the security side, I have great concerns that there is going to be a temptation, just as there is now, for malicious actors to come in and to have a complete bonanza around the whole AI arena. All you need are criminal actors who are already gaining access to our systems to have some knowledge about how AI systems are set up. And they can either compromise or they can manipulate systems. And let's say you had an automated insurance system where you had automated, or you were using AI to come up with insurance quotes, or whether you could sift through a number of insurance claims and decide which ones to pay out. A malicious actor could go in and do something very simple, like dropping in a keyword into the algorithm, such that whenever that keyword appeared, a claim would be approved, and suddenly you've got an open marketplace. So the problem here is if it's a very simple calculated system, and all of a sudden when 2 and 2 are put in, it stops coming out with 4. You know it's been compromised. But with an AI system where you can't predict the outcomes, you don't know whether something's been compromised or whether it's being manipulated. So I have concerns there. But Des, I know that you've been looking a lot at the copyright side of things.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, and we talked about this offline before we hit record, was this whole issue where it's all well and good for these platform builders and large language model developers and trainers to go out and scrape the internet, and as far as I'm concerned, steal content. And there's some very large class actions being taken in multiple parts of the world now, certainly North America, where one in particular with a range of copywriters, artists, and photographers, and the hundreds of thousands are pursuing one particular brand that we won't name. It's all well and good to go out and scrape the internet and steal this content and feed it in, but we are now seeing a situation that we spoke about earlier offline, which is where you've got generative content in various forms, whether it's written text for blogs and articles, or homework and schoolwork, whether it's music or whether it's photography or pseudo art paintings being put out back on the internet, and then these systems keep scraping the internet and find content that they were used to produce. So you've got a scenario where somebody's book was used to train the model, that book is then used to produce blogs and articles and homework, it's put back out on the internet, the system finds it again and then feeds on it. And it's effectively feeding on itself. That, stolen content gets used to produce material from generative AI tools, and generative AI tools are then fed from models that are trained on their own stuff. So you just end up with this, like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail and going into an infinite deadly cycle. And eventually that is going to not only create massive copyright nightmares, because you don't know whose content was used to create what content and what content was then produced for other content and so forth. And, it's turtles all the way down to the elephant. But you also then have this challenge around not just copyright, but also the accuracy or the veracity of this data, and that is that somebody may have written a report or a piece of research and it's been validated by other peers. It's then gone into a model. Some hallucination apparently has been taking place, which is a ridiculous coinage. It just means it made errors. That material might be used by a student for a piece of homework or whatever, or it could even be a PhD. And if people aren't diligent enough to pick up on any errors in it, that PhD is published, and then students work on that PhD or other research is done. It's just an inward spiral, sort of a race to zero, if you like, a net sum zero game. And so I think there's this balance between, protecting copyright versus using the content. And I know there's a lot of talk about deals being done with the likes of Reddit and certainly some stock photography platforms that have licensed their content to some of the large language model developers and trainers, and that's great. But I'm sure that's a drop in the ocean compared to the entire internet. So yeah, there's this challenge of what content was used and the copyright that goes into it, and also one of the things that I think you are going to be able to give us a lot of insight on now, which is what happens when we end up with this snake eating its own tail, this Ouroboros that is just endlessly chasing this net zero sum game of basically content that no one can make any sense of.
So just one of my concerns is around the feedback loop that you've described in terms of accuracy and privacy. We started from a point where the AI models were scraping the internet for their information on which to create their large language models. Now, the accuracy of the information of the internet was already fairly questionable in many different areas, and I'm sure that you're not going to dispute me on that front. But as the AI models then introduce the odd hallucination or mistake of its own, the next round of scraping is going to be actually starting to absorb not just original internet content, but a level of AI content as well. And then as we go further and further into the AI era, more and more of the content is AIs absorbing content that's already been created by AI. So you have the problem here that you could get a feedback loop where certain types of information are actually going to be absorbed and amplified. And the two that I'm most concerned about, first of all, are information that lacks accuracy, and we could have the amplification and a feedback loop perpetuating myths. But also there's around privacy. So if somebody has inadvertently included personal information without permission, or potentially there have been information data sets that have been illegally obtained and put on the dark web or the internet that include a whole load of information, possibly even credit card numbers or whatever, who knows, then that will get inadvertently scraped and incorporated into the LLMs. And each time that you have an iterative loop, it gets spread further and further. The issue at hand here is that GDPR mandates not only that organizations have to, on request, show you what information they hold on you, but also you have the right to be forgotten. Now, if data has been inadvertently collected that is private information on you, but that it is percolated throughout an entire LLM model, it's actually going to be impossible to locate or even remove. It was enough of a challenge with corporate databases where they had hierarchical information and individual records. But in LLM models, it's almost impossible. And I think therefore I have major concerns about the ability of these models to comply either with accuracy or with privacy.
Indeed. And so it reminds me of a time, it reminds me of very early teenage years. I think I was 15 or 16, and I made the mistake of not deliberately plagiarizing outright, but quoting a bit too frequently one of my favorite pieces of writing, and submitted it in an essay. And my English teacher took it up and ripped it and threw it in the bin and said, "There's no point rewriting any of this. The entire thing is nonsense. Start from scratch and use your own words." I think there's going to be a time where some of these large language models are just going to have to be deleted. You get, as you said, you get to the point where not only have you scraped the internet and that content hasn't necessarily been validated, but no one has read every single piece of information that OpenAI used when it scraped the internet, and whether it begged, borrowed, or stole content is irrelevant. It sourced content that it did not ask for in the first place. No one validated it. Very few people even know what's in there. We ask it questions and we make up coinages like hallucination where it just makes mistakes. There's this black box with $1 billion+ worth of data and training in it. At some point, we may just have to say, let's just do a do-over, because it's now eating its own content. It's gotten content that wasn't validated. No one even knew it went in there. It's been used in a generative AI fashion to produce other content that's been published in whatever form. And we know it's being used by lawyers. We know that it's been used by chatbots who've had to in court be held up and held accountable for an airline in Canada. It's certainly been found to be used and abused in schools and universities around the world. That content makes its way to the internet and refound it on it goes. So, at some point you get this sense that you just end up with nonsense going into nonsense, garbage in, garbage out. And, if you're building an enterprise system and your database is just full of garbage, there's only one option. You wipe the database and start from scratch and rebuild from your original sources. And you don't go to a backup. So, I do have this concern at some point we are going to need some sort of measure to say, not only is the quality of the content coming out of this being dramatically reduced, but the quality is such that it's unusable. And it comes with a whole range of issues, particularly reputational risk. I think this is something that hasn't really been touched on in a large part because people are just trying to desperately avoid it. But, there's legal issues, whether it's copyright or just outright, incorrect data, as that lawyer found in North America when he used it to write his papers to submit to court. But there's also a situation where when something goes horribly wrong, we know with a data breach, for example, companies go into panic mode and spend untold amounts of money to recover from that brand damage. More often the case, it's brand damage they're fixing, not the actual impact to the customers. They invariably probably don't care about that, even though they say they do. But the reputational damage that could come from this when such a large volume of information is coming out of these platforms, whether it's data, whether it's blogs, whatever, that reputational damage may get to the point where it's almost impossible to gain back as well. And your crisis management work has done a lot of focus on this. What are your thoughts with regard to the reputational risk that comes with not knowing what went into the large language models and then not necessarily being able to validate what came out of them?
I think and a lot of what I do around the whole crisis management side of things and responding to cyber incidents focuses at various different levels. And the initial level, which is the technology fix, is only one part of it. And then there's the legal side and the reputational side. And typically the largest damage in terms of cost is on the reputational side. So you need to be aware of that. But there's another aspect that I'd like to touch on in terms of the AI regulation here. It's all well and good introducing what is very worthy regulation with a lot of stipulations around ethics and other things that are equally worthy. But my query here is, how is it going to be enforced? We already have a problem where the law enforcement bodies are across the world are struggling to deal with domestic crime, from burglary to whatever. They don't have the skills to actually do some really complex investigations that would be needed in this era. And I'm not sure your average cop has much in the way of AI skills. And what we've seen with GDPR was we had what was a lot of privacy abuse in relatively plain sight. I mean, everyone knew that large organizations like Facebook and Google were doing things that were questionable in the extreme. But none of the regulators, none of the governments, none of the police forces were doing anything about it. And then very famously, I worked to support Max Schrems and a group of privacy campaigners who took Facebook to the European High Court and eventually got them sanctioned and fined $1 billion or £1 billion. And this was the largest fine in the world ever at this particular point. And okay, so it probably made them sit up and think, but I'm not convinced that it's solved the problem. And the big question here was, why should it fall to a handful of well-motivated activists who crowdfunded their expenses to actually take on the big tech and challenge them in this way? It just exposes the fact that the regulators and others are ineffective and are doing nothing. And how can we have confidence when moving on from GDPR to AI regulations? How can we have any confidence at all that governments, regulators and others are going to be any more effective on the enforcement front than they have been with GDPR?
Well, the challenge then is, as you said, and a couple of key points I'd like to touch on there. I commend the European Union on their work on developing this first framework and essentially the version 1 of their European Union's AI Act. I think it's a fantastic move. I think it's very timely. In many ways, it was overdue. And like GDPR, they've been an early pundit of putting some controls around these things. At least, if nothing else, it gives us a vernacular and language with which to have this conversation that needs to be had. But as you said, who polices the police is sort of that classic Roman phrase, right? So we've seen this with a number of things in large organizations and other technologies. Banks often bring in third-party consulting partners to help them in tax advisory or compliance advisory, where they're a bank and that's what their core business is. And they aren't necessarily a tax specialist. They aren't necessarily IT consultant specialists. And the same applies to big data, cloud analytics, you name it. AI is no different. I think that's going to continue to be the case, but there's a shortage, as we'll talk about in a moment, in skill sets in that, even within some of the bigger consulting firms, specifically the famous four. So that's going to be an interesting challenge. But I think it is, just going back to that key point, I think it's great that this is actually being put in place. But as you said, you've got a very small team of people inside the EU who have been able to put this framework together and put it out to the world to consider. But then it needs an entire unit around it. It kind of needs its own NATO to go and hunt people down to figure out what to do about offenders. But it also needs to be able to define clearly what an offence actually is. Because if you start coming into my organisation telling me that I've broken the AI Act in some way, I need to be able to actually understand what that infringement is. And we've seen some interesting actions around this with companies in the AI space. We've been talking for a while about the need for a chief artificial intelligence officer. We've got risk officers and other roles like that. I know Click, for example, have just appointed an AI council, a multi-person team. I think it's 4 people from memory. Key specialists from around the world with the relevant skills in AI, both practitioners and strategic and strategy-focused roles, and people from all walks of life to help them not only put together this council from an advisory point of view, but also essentially, I'm sure they're going to help them approach challenges like the AI Act out of the EU, and we'll soon see the US respond to that. And I know Australia is already working on that kind of framework, and I know the rest of Asia is, certainly Japan's talked about it. So on one front, yep, it's great that they've put this in place. On the other front, as you highlighted, it's very, very difficult to police. Who's going to do the policing, both within the EU themselves and globally, and also within the organizations. And that brings me to another point we were going to talk about, which is an article that we put out earlier this week on elnyon.com, and that is the challenge of finding AI-related skills and the resources for those in particular. And, it isn't necessarily the specialist skills that we were just talking about with regards to regulatory and compliance requirements. A lot of organizations are telling us now that they're just finding it hard to find people with any form of quote-unquote AI skill that they can put in place and expect to start working on Monday. And one of the things that I'm keen to get your thoughts on is this desire to hire, there's a classic joke about somebody, and I forget the technology, but there was a recent technology. It was an open source tool. The young guy had published it 3 to 4 years later, that he saw an advert saying that they wanted a role was available with someone with 20 years experience in that thing. And I jokingly tweeted to him that he should apply for it because it'd be quite funny to get to the interview and they tell him he hasn't got 20 years experience. And he say, yeah, I'm sorry, I only invented it 5 years ago. But there's this frontline challenge where organizations are struggling to find people with AI skills for everyday roles in operational spaces, not even just strategy related and planning, even just finding a project manager that even understands technology well enough. But then also there's this reluctance in my experience so far in the last 12 to 18 months, where people are not really looking to hire staff for AI related roles and train them and skill them and certify them. So you can imagine a scenario that if someone's going to be working on, say, Snowflake, the SaaS cloud-based AI platform and data management platform, they may have some basic skills in accounting or whatever the role might be, and they're asked to use these AI tools in the accounting department or the finance department. But organizations seem to be very reluctant to hire those people and then put them through, let's say in this case, Snowflake's training and certification, to then go and say, okay, I have a 20 or 30 year pedigree in finance or accounting. I'm now up to speed and trained on Snowflake and I have certification. Now I can do the job. There's this expectation that people are going to hit the job and start on Monday and just magically have these skills. And I don't think that's ever going to be the case if it ever was. What are your thoughts on this, Bill?
Well, I think you've touched on a couple of things there. First of all, you mentioned the EU regulation. I think it's enormously worthy that they've done it. And although I retain a certain amount of skepticism about the enforcement, it is definitely a step in the right direction. And I know that Australia have been very quick to come forward with some really insightful regulations, certainly on social media and other areas. In many instances, Australia have led the world in that, and we expect to see something soon from them. My concern is that the US, we have a level of gridlock in Congress, which is beyond belief. They haven't even got as far as enacting a federal privacy regulation yet. And I think there's some distance from actually catching up with the rest of the world. And I think it is of major concern because many of the largest AI organizations are based in the US. And obviously you touch on skills, and maybe this is an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about where you might go for better information. And one of the areas you might go to sort of bring yourself up to speed on this is a new podcast site that we're launching as part of the Elnyon umbrella. This is Podnyon. Des, can you just say a few words about Podnyon? It's something that hopefully we expect to feature in the very near future.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so Elnyon is essentially what we would refer to as our media site: blogs, articles, reports, written interviews and so forth, press release, cover stories, and all things written. We've now just launched in a stealth mode in many ways, but maybe not so stealthy as of today, a platform called Podnyon. It's podnion.com. Podnyon is essentially our B2B focused business technology and telco and all related things, AI, data science, cybersecurity, etc. podcast platform. We have imported hundreds of our library of not only the first half a dozen shows, but also the entire library of the likes of Conversations with Des over the last number of years, individual episodes that are available now. And we would love you to go and visit it and give us some feedback. It is a version 1.0 minimum viable product, so be a little gentle. But we'll be looking at launching new shows focused on key topics: transport, logistics, aviation. There's about 17 in all, including yourself, Bill, hosting and co-hosting a number of those shows. We'll be looking to talk to CEOs and their teams. And we've had a number of these from Waylay and a couple of other organizations recently that are about to be published there, talking to the CEO, talking to the founder and chief operating officer about what they're doing around AI, big data analytics, hyperautomation. So podneon.com is live. You'll see links wherever you see this video. We'll be promoting it through social media. And you'll be seeing myself and Bill, hearing us, I should say, because it's podcast in its proper form. It's an audio form podcast platform. And we'd also like organizations to come to us and have a conversation about taking up a featured guest spot and being on the shows and share their insights and news around what they're doing with news announcements and any other innovations, mergers, acquisitions, etc. And obviously we would look to talk to partners who might want to bring their content online as well.
And stepping back then again to Elnion, obviously we've touched on one particular article, which has been the one that we've been talking about, decoding the EU AI Act and the landmark regulation for artificial intelligence. But there's a whole host of other articles which I wanted to highlight because, again, AI has been a massive theme on the site over recent weeks and possibly will continue to be so. Now, there are 3 articles in particular I wanted to focus on. Obviously, there's one here that we talked about that was around skills, and maybe we can just dive straight into the skills shortage one. You were touching on that a second ago. Obviously, the skills shortage goes a lot wider than maybe just the law enforcement organisations that I touched on, but many of the organisations themselves. And there's a whole host of different things, from skilling up and actually being able to apply the technology and finding people who can do it, but also having the skills to actually go beyond that to understand how it's being operated, integrated into other systems, and possibly even being able to detect if and when it's been compromised or manipulated. Yeah. So there's a massive demand in terms of skills and a shortage that simply hasn't been addressed yet.
Indeed. And, we need to remind ourselves that this is still, the concept of artificial intelligence goes way back to 1960 when the first piece of code was written on some mainframes to test this idea of whether we could teach computers to play chess, for example, or tic-tac-toe or so forth. And when we look at it today, there's still a big or a dearth of a huge chasm of gap in the knowledge from boardroom down. And a lot of people talk about it, as you said, maybe I've got Siri in my phone, but when I asked 10 people yesterday, do they use AI every day, they sort of came up with a couple of different answers, and they were very weird. I said, well, you've got a smartphone, don't you talk to the smart agent in them? They're like, oh, maybe I ask it to set an alarm or ask it what the weather's like. But it was interesting that one of the most powerful AI tools that everyone has is actually the smartphone in their hand, and they almost invariably don't use it. But when they do use it, they're not aware that it can do a whole range of other things than just tell them what the weather is, for example, or in some cases just give them a blue dot to follow across a map to get across the city. So I think there's an opportunity now for organizations to step back and realize that they probably should do a skills audit and work out what skills have they currently got in place and where AI fits into those roles going forward, and whether they need to get additional training and certification to make sure they are going to actually be right skills for the roles going forward. But also, from boardroom down, does the CEO and does the chairperson and does the CFO, CIO, CRO, CDO, CMO et al., CISO included, do they have the right skill set? If the CEO of an organization can't stand in front of a town hall conversation house and have a conversation about where their AI strategy is going, then that needs to be addressed right now, because as we saw with cloud and as we saw with big data and other things, these are not trends that are just going to come and vanish. I mean, cloud isn't going anywhere. And for 6 years, I remember running around the country in Australia and certainly the world talking about the need for cloud transformation training and skills and planning and roadmaps and strategies. And very few people got ready for it, and then just cloud smacked them in the face. This one, when AI hit the deck, it is even bigger. So yeah, I think there's this whole challenge of just, as you said, navigating that skills shortage. And there's also another story here that we'll just touch on briefly, and that is that there's a big challenge that organizations are finding in streamlining the integration of these AI solutions with their existing platforms, whether it's email for co-pilots, whether it's their CRM for customer relations, whether it's banking platforms. It's all well and good to extract data and pull it out and use data science to find some things that maybe to make some decisions on that. But the automation of going from one to the other, pulling data out of a system and using analytics and AI to find things and then put it back into the system, that is both a non-trivial challenge and streamlining that process is proving to be even more difficult. And I think there's an entire space here now for consulting and professional developers through to practitioners to actually help look at where that streamlining needs to be done. And Bill, I know you've been doing a lot of stuff around this with regard to your work in ports and other areas, which we'll come back in a second. And then another story that's up there that I think I would love everyone to have a quick look at, and that is the legal issue around reputational risk that AI is going to bring about, particularly the AI implementations. We know that when people moved to the cloud, there were data breaches because security wasn't implemented correctly. We know when they implemented particular CRMs and ERPs, data maybe got lost. There's been circumstances where banks or in phone companies implemented technology, and so whether it was cloud related or not, an entire data dumps was stolen. That is going to be, thousandfold even more challenging in this whole sort of maze of ethical challenges around the mitigation of legal and reputational risks around AI and the implementation of AI-based solutions. And I know you do a lot of work in this space as well, Bill. So there's three big stories there that we think we would love, we would love some feedback on. We'd love people to consume and look at. We'd also like them to have a conversation with us as well through, LinkedIn groups, Twitter, Facebook Business, and wherever you might be. And we've also recently just this week launched some WhatsApp channels that we'd love to have people join as well, where those conversations will take place. But we're going to have a big focus on AI for obvious reasons, necessarily so, because that's what people want to hear from. But we will be bringing other, other stories and contributors on board for all the normal business technology and telco spaces. But AI is getting a lot of attention now, and necessarily we're focusing on that. But Bill, you've done some work in a couple of key areas, and one I was really keen to get your thoughts on where AI skills are going to play out, and that is around the risks that can be applied to ports and authorities, and you've got a simulation platform around that. Where do you think you're going to find skills shortages, and how do you mitigate those in that sort of space where you're helping people run simulations around risk and incidents in particularly in ports and banks, initially from cybersecurity, but I imagine you're going to then also have a similar challenge in finding skills in the AI suite.
I think the skills challenge is going to be continuing for some time to come before we get anywhere near addressing it. Much of my focus is actually on helping to train executive teams, especially in the area of critical infrastructure, banks, ports, other different things. I mean, if a major port was taken out, we would certainly in the UK find that our supermarket shelves ground to a halt and were bare in no time at all. And we've seen this for real in Australia recently with a major hack of some Australian ports that took out Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Fremantle, and something like 40% of all trade in and out of Australia are ground to a complete halt because you simply can't manage the complex operation, things like ports or banks or anything, because they're all digitized these days. And to bring home the reputational risk here, which you were touching on in one of those AI stories, if we have a bank, say, and people are wandering with shotguns and hold the place up, then it's very obvious who the villains are in the piece, and it's very obvious who the victims are. The villains are the guys with the guns, and the victims are the bank, its staff and its employees. And when the media write up the story, they're looking for victims and villains. And therefore, it would be very clear in that instance that if you rolled out an executive to say, oh, we're terribly sorry that any stress to customers and staff, and shows lots and lots of empathy, you're going to get sympathy as you're seen as the victim of a crime. If the same bank is hacked, the situation is reversed. The villains in that things, well, the actual villains may well be the hackers, but you don't necessarily know who they are, when they hack things or whatever. But if you look at the societal and the media attitude to it all, universally you will find that it's the bank that gets the blame for having been hacked, for having not prevented it. And a lot of organizations simply don't understand that in a digital era, if you don't get it right, it is a massive reputational risk, and you will be held to blame. And therefore, if you fail on cybersecurity, if you fail on the ethical implementation of AI, then it's your reputation the risk. You can't shift the blame. And one thing that could possibly focus a few more minds at the board level is that we're starting to see individual accountability focused on executives at board level. We've seen with some data breaches the start of litigation against individual board members where they're being held individually liable. Now, there is a precedent here. Once upon a time, health and safety was an area where a lot of organizations were being pushed with fresh regulations, and the attitudes and behavior weren't changing. Things only really changed when the regulations were changed to introduce individual board level accountability. And all of a sudden we saw a complete sea change in the attitude to health and safety. We're starting to see some of this in terms of litigation in a lot of the digital space. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about digital reputation and AI. We could well be seeing a sea change here. And therefore, if you're sitting at board level and you're thinking that, these AI models, this cybersecurity, it's not a business problem, it's just an IT problem. Well, the moment it goes wrong, it's very much a business problem for the board and the whole organization. And so you'd be very well advised to actually take some steps in advance to make sure that you are prepared. And a lot of the preparation for these sort of things is a lot of the training that I do. So it's a very interesting area, and I don't think it's going to go away.
No. While you were saying that the villains, the people with the guns, I had a flashback of the 1980s movie RoboCop, where the first iteration of the robot shot the good guys with guns, thinking the bad guys, and I'm immediately thinking that AI could very easily make that mistake.
I think, there's a whole other kettle of fish there that I think we possibly need to be concerned about sometime in the future.
Indeed, but not so far. But I do want to circle back on that point you just made, which is, I think, hypercritical for CEOs in particular, and certainly inside boards, where the buck stops with them. And we've seen that with data breaches. We've seen that with failure to comply with privacy. There's some very big fines being lobbied against organizations. And a lot of them are Silicon Valley-based tech startups per se in our mind, although Google and Facebook and those companies are not startups, but the tech firms. But it's also happened to companies all around the world. But these fines have gone from millions to tens of millions to now 100+ million. And I guess these fines are going to continue to grow until somebody pays attention. The issue of a data breach or a data privacy issue and getting a $100 million fine is all well and good. But I think the scale at which this could go all wrong now, if the large language models are allowed to run unfettered for too much longer, is that it could become billions or more very, very quickly. Because we're seeing the likes of the first generative transformer chatbot tool had 100 million people sign up in the first week or so. This adoption is extremely fast, is extremely wide and broad and deep. And the risk profile of that is becoming larger and larger by the hour, not just the day. So more and more people are exposed to AI tools. More and more people are expected to work with them. More and more people expect to have the skills and the resources and experience to know what to do with them. That may not be the case. And then over time, very, very quickly, these risks get quite high. So yes, I think when we circle back what we've covered through, the European Union's AI Act is a great start. It's provided a framework. It just needs to be looked at from the point of view that is the starting point. It's the first step. It now needs a lot more work to get to the point where the framework itself is able to be described. And it reminds me of sort of ISO 27001, 27002 when cybersecurity practitioners were handed these two standards and then told, have at it, go with it. And the framework was there, but there was a lot of work to be done for decades, 15, 17 years in my experience, of putting ISO 27001 and 27002 into practice in the cybersecurity world. And even today, people struggle putting that framework into place. It's been around for decades. So an interesting first step. It just needs to be monitored and I guess, handheld through the process over the next 3 to 5 years, but hopefully sooner than that. The challenge of talent shortage, as you spoke about, that needs to be addressed immediately as well. and dealing with the issue of integration of AI systems and tools into legacy platforms. And I think email is going to be one of those where it catches that out if we don't quickly get on top of the integration issues where co-pilots are being used for the likes of automating responses to emails that could go all wrong, as we saw with that airline and a chatbot incident where they had to essentially pay out not just the $385 refund on the fine, but thousands, if not, I think it was like $15,000 US in legal fees that the fellow had to pursue them with. That then wraps up into that third story we talked about with reputational risk. So we've got a whole bunch of content up on elneo.com we would like people to engage with, read, consume, share with their friends. We've got podneon.com live now. And hopefully this time next month, we'll have the next project for the year, which will be our video platform, which we'll be able to share with you. But Bill, I think we've had an enormously great roundup of this week's news. And I imagine next week we're going to have another dearth of exciting stuff. And hopefully people will engage on digital and social platforms with us, throw their questions at us, follow some of the hashtags and links. And wherever you see this video, you will see details of where they will be. Follow Bill and I, if you wouldn't mind, on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook Business. And also, you'll see details of our new WhatsApp channels where you'll be able to follow Elneon and Podneon and so forth as well, and join the conversation there.
Well, that's brilliant, Des. We don't want to sound alarmist here. We hope that by providing some discussion and highlighting some of the concerns, we can help you prepare. Another way that you can help prepare and educate yourself is with the articles on Elneon, the podcast on Podneon, and hopefully a lot more to come. We'll be keeping to provide a good cadence of discussions like this, and we look forward to having you follow us and hopefully even join us. There'll be guests joining us on these programs in the near future, and we'll keep the discussion going. Des, thank you very much for joining me here today. We'll see you again next week.
Likewise, Bill. Thanks. Always fun. We'll see everyone next week. Thanks for your time.